Diversity. What a fascinating subject, isn't it? Isn't it amazing that when you think about all the billions of people that have lived over Earth's history, barring any identical twins, no one's been exactly alike genetically. And thanks to independent assortment and sexual reproduction, crossing over during meiosis, you get all these different combinations of traits. And so when a population evolves, it just means there are changes that are occurring from generation to generation. Evolution means change. So we're going to think about this idea of species, and scientists really have a hard time defining what a species is, but we're going to do our best to do so in an objective manner. We're going to understand the difference between small-scale evolution, which is microevolution, and the kind of evolution that is described as happening over a much longer period of time that results in the progressive generation of more and more diversity. You're going to learn about certain reproductive barriers, prezygotic, meaning there are factors that keep organisms from being able to reproduce together but before fertilization could even have a chance to happen. And then there's postzygotic barriers. Maybe mating does happen, but for whatever reason, viable offspring cannot be produced. We're going to learn about different kinds of speciation, and we're going to learn what happens to chromosome numbers during speciation event sometimes. Punctuated equilibrium, that's basically a model that says sometimes change happens very, very rapidly, and then there's periods of very little change. So evolution does not happen at a constant rate. It very, very rarely does. But then we're going to contrast that with Darwinian's model of gradual change. Speciation, what does that mean? We're talking about the origin of a species. You've probably heard that the number of species on our planet is decreasing, mostly because of human encroachment on the habitat of plants and animals. But sometimes there might be new species that arise because of new selective pressures. Maybe there's a drastic change to the environment. Maybe two populations become isolated from each other, and then they start becoming more distinct. Then we start calling them separate species. So there are cumulative effects of speciation over long periods of time, or sometimes even short periods of time. Some species may have very, very interesting resemblances, but they might be classified differently for reasons that are not immediately apparent. Maybe this bird has a different dance or a different song, and so it'll never attract a female as shown here. So they might be classified as a different species because they never breed together anyway, although they look very similar. So the point is, sometimes similar-looking organisms may not necessarily be classified together as the same species. I might show this on another day, maybe later on next week. But let's move on to probably the most easily understood way of defining a species. Your book talks about this. A species is a population or a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature and produce viable, fertile offspring. In other words, they're reproductively compatible, and we've observed them to be such. But there are lots of exceptions to this. That's what makes this so murky. There are examples of different species interbreeding and producing hybrids. It happens with mammals, it happens with birds, it happens with fish. So then it leads us to ask the question, all right, do we fully understand what a species is to begin with? But this is the best thing we can do. This is the best definition we can offer, even though there are exceptions out there. So reproductive isolation. These are barriers that prevent members from reproducing. Usually it's members of two different species. And then if they do manage to reproduce, then we would get a hybrid. But in order for them to be considered the same species, those hybrid offspring would have to be fertile. But again, there are many cases where two different species produce fertile offspring, and yet they're still considered two separate species. For example, polar bears. Polar bears are known to breed with grizzlies. Did you guys know this? I think they call them Prisleys, don't they? You might want to look it up. Prisleys, yes.
Grizzlies?
Prisleys, Prizzleys. And Dylan's going to prove me wrong by him, but it's either Prisleys or, yeah, I think it is. I can't think of an alternative name if I'm going to give. But anyway, one could say, well, Mr. Zimmerman, if this definition holds true in every case, then when a grizzly breeds with a polar bear and they produce offspring, can't we now just start calling them all the same species, even though they have two different species names right now? Okay, valid point. So that's what I mean by this definition of species being a little bit murky. So there are cases where two different species, but members of the same genus will breed and you get viable offspring. All right, prezygotic barriers. These are factors that keep two organisms from coming together to mate. In other words, population is just not going to happen. Maybe it's because, in the case of many birds, the song that's sung is just not good enough. Or maybe the dance or the show of colors in the feathers is just not impressive enough. What's appealing to one species may not be appealing to another. And so the behavior of organisms often is a prezygotic barrier. Okay? So, for example, I'm just picking examples here. Well, let's say there are two species of birds that live in the same area. And they live in the same area, but they're not reproducing together. So maybe there's a difference in their breeding season, or there's a difference in how they attract mates. There are a lot of different prezygotic barriers that could be in place. But what if I, as a geneticist, was interested to know if I could get some offspring? If I cross species 1 with species 2, could I get offspring? I could do an in vitro fertilization experiment in the laboratory. I might be able to get offspring. Because maybe these two species diverged from an ancestor bird. Anyway, surely they did. So you would think the genetic similarity might be good enough for me to get some offspring in the lab. But in nature, they don't naturally breed, so we still call them separate species. So habitat isolation. Hey, if there's a mountain that separates two different populations of mammals, that would function as a barrier. It keeps them from reproducing together. Temporal isolation. So maybe they're separated. Maybe one species is extinct or about to go extinct. The other one is thriving. So there's a separation in time. Behavioral isolation. Like I said, the mating behaviors are a big one. Mechanical isolation. I mean, think about like big cats versus small cats. Like a mountain lion, they live in the white tanks. Do you guys know that? We have a few mountain lions in the white tanks. Those are big cats. They can be 170 pounds or even more. It's bigger than me. We also have bobcats. Now, would a mountain lion breed with bobcat? I'm kind of thinking a mountain lion would be more likely to eat a bobcat if given the opportunity, because bobcats are really small, right? So there are behavioral barriers in place, mechanical barriers. I don't know if a mountain lion could even breed with a bobcat. There might be a mechanical issue in terms of competition. Oh, there you go. Those are some examples. Now, I could take a sperm from, let's say, a bobcat and an egg from a mountain lion if I were a geneticist, and I might have some success. And they have the same number of chromosomes anyway. I could get offspring. I could get a hybrid of those two. But we still call them separate species because there are all these barriers in place that keep them from reproducing. Postzygotic, that means maybe fertilization happens, but there are barriers that keep viable offspring from forming or persisting. So you might get a hybrid, but the hybrid may not develop into an organism that can reproduce, or maybe if it's fertile, it might not live long enough. Maybe for whatever reason, it's not healthy. So reduced hybrid viability just means the offspring are not healthy. They won't survive very long. Hybrid fertility. If the offspring do not have the ability to reproduce upon maturity, then that would count as a barrier, reproductive barrier. Hybrid breakdown. If we have a lot of species that are crossing together, distinct species, and we get a lot of hybrids, and then those hybrids cross with other hybrids, and there are some cases where somewhere along the line, offspring may end up being infertile. So that would be a reproductive barrier as well. So here's a little map that shows the different kinds of isolation. Habitat isolation, that's when two organisms move or live in different places. So temporal isolation, behavioral isolation, as I mentioned, mechanical. So maybe the two organisms are not able to make sperm meet egg for whatever reason, even if they try. Gametic isolation. So if sperm is released and the egg is ready to be fertilized, there may be something preventing these gametes from coming together. Okay, so other reproductive barriers, these are the postzygotic. So sperm meets egg, that doesn't mean offspring will necessarily be healthy or even that they'll form. So this is a salamander. I've seen these in the Adirondacks. In fact, I've held one of these in my hand. It looked exactly like that. So if this crosses with some other salamander, we get a hybrid. And maybe if that hybrid crosses with some other salamander, we might get another type of hybrid, but that hybrid may not be as healthy as the prior. Maybe it's not as well adapted. Maybe it has, maybe it lacks certain features that would help it survive. Reduced hybrid fertility. So this is the case with some species of horses, mules, donkeys. So if it's actually a myth that all mules are infertile. Some of them can reproduce, but some of them have some difficulty doing that. So that's an example of reduced hybrid fertility. Hybrid breakdown. So that's when the hybrids over time may end up not being able to reproduce or produce viable offspring. So there are other ways to define a species. There's a morphological concept. This is just, it's pretty simple, at least in concept. It just says that if two organisms have unique physical structures compared to each other, call them separate species. On the other hand, there are some interesting differences between two species that do not necessarily prevent them from breeding. Like polar bears and grizzly bears, a very distinct coat color. Polar bears are bigger even than grizzly bears, but yet they have no problem producing offspring. So if you describe the size of the body as a morphological, an example of morphological differences, not always a barrier, but it could be. Ecological definition, niche, role in the community. So what if one species has a different role in the community? That might serve as a basis for classifying it as its own unique species if there's no other species that has that niche. Phylogenetic. So this is kind of like a philosophical approach where if you say that, oh, I think this organism is related to this organism through a common ancestor, but it's less closely related to this one than that one, then you can classify organisms according to whatever your assumption or your preconception is as to how the evolutionary tree of life unfolded. This one's really sketchy. It's not really science, it's philosophy. But these, you could use observations in nature to give organisms species names based on these. But scientists usually stick to the biological species concept definition. So here's an example of a geographic barrier that has been forming. So let's say there's a lake, and let's say it's sitting on top of a fault line. There's volcanic activity, and some of this like igneous rock starts to form a barrier. Now you've got two parts of the population that are separated. And if there's a mutation in this population and not in that one, then you could, in theory, get two different species. Now, could they breed together if one kind of just hopped over the barrier? Probably, yeah. But yet we still call them separate species because if they're normally now separated from each other, they're not going to breed together. All right, any questions about that? So there are two modes of speciation. There's something called allopatric, and this is when organisms become isolated from other similar organisms, but then they become less similar. So how did they get isolated? Maybe geologic events. Think about islands. There are all kinds of species exist on islands, and obviously they're isolated from other organisms that are not on those islands. So the speciation events occur pretty readily and easily on islands. And then natural selection can get going. Nature will select those species that survive best in those isolated environments. And the selective pressure might be different in those places than in others. So like on the Grand Canyon, on the north rim, there are squirrels that have a stripe, I think it is, and then on the south side, they don't have a stripe. I might have gotten it backwards. But those squirrels don't come together. They don't reproduce together because they're geographically isolated from each other. Now, you could take a sperm from the striped squirrel and unite it with an egg cell with the other variation in the laboratory, and you're going to get squirrels, hybrids. But they don't do that naturally in nature. So that's allopatric speciation. Then there's sympathetic. These populations are not geographically isolated. They exist in the same area. These populations exist in the same home range, so their home ranges overlap. There's even gene flow between these subpopulations. There's no gene flow, or very little gene flow. Why are genes not flowing? There's some sexual selection at play. Maybe in that environment, there are parts of the environment that are different than other parts. Like we think about trees and grasslands. Some animals prefer living in the trees. Others prefer living in on the grass. Especially if they can't fly, they have not much choice, unless they're good tree climbers. But natural selection will sort that out. And so polyploidy is when there are many chromosomes, an increase in the number of chromosomes from generation to generation. We observe this with a lot of plants. And so this change in chromosome number could result in a speciation event. But it could happen with different varieties that exist in the same area. So slide, I don't know if it's about that. So some squirrels have a more distinct stripe, and others don't. They're separated by this barrier, this geographic barrier. That's an example of allopatric speciation. That's just a little wild and crazy. Unlike with animals, when you have a change in chromosome number, it can be very, very detrimental to the species. With plants, they're really resilient. There are times when you can get hybrids, and when you get these hybrids, sometimes the chromosome number might end up being different than the ancestors from which they came, or the parents from which they came, and we end up with, instead of a 2n diploid number, we end up sometimes with more than 2n, maybe 4n or 6n. And so they call this autopolyploidy. So, and yet offspring can still be viable. They can produce offspring. So we can have speciation events in plants due to changes in chromosome number. And it's not detrimental to individuals like it is with a lot of animals. So when you're producing hybrids, these chromosome numbers will vary from one species to another, and the speciation events can occur in this way. Allopolyploidy. So here's species A. The 2n number is 6, let's say. Species B, 2n number is 4. So 4 chromosomes here, 6 chromosomes there. And what's crazy is they can produce a hybrid, even though their chromosome numbers are different. So here's hybrid, and let's say this gamete has 4 chromosomes, but it's an unreduced gamete. Sometimes some species of plants will actually do this. Their gametes are not necessarily haploid. But let's say this one does produce a haploid gamete, and then you get 7 chromosomes. And so the result is that through the generations, you'll have some plants that are a distinct species because of these changes in chromosome numbers. But again, animals don't get away with this. Right? If this happens with animals, offspring will not form, generally speaking. So this is one mechanism for evolution in plants. Whenever you come across this term adaptive radiation, we're talking about how we start with one or a few organisms, or maybe one species, and then branching off from that, we might get several other species. Radiation means to spread out from a common source. So a few organisms may make way for two new distant areas. So when they move from one place to another, the selective pressures might be different, the environment's different, and so the combination of traits that's considered valuable in one environment will be different than in another. So then we have a speciation event. So if there's an environmental change, that can lead to extinction, but it can also lead to adaptations where organisms occupy new niches to ensure their survival. That's adaptive radiation. An example would be Hawaii. Hawaii is an isolated place. You know, a lot of birds have migrated to Hawaii over, the centuries. And so there are species of birds and species of plants that live there that don't live anywhere else because they've been geographically isolated for so long. How do plants get to Hawaii anyway? How would a new species, let's rewind like 2,000 years. What do you say, Isabel? What's that?
People travel to the island.
Okay.
Have brought new species of plants with them.
Okay. Yeah, certainly, especially nowadays, right? All kinds of invasive species. Even here in the valley, there are species of trees that are here that weren't here 300 years ago because people bring in the plants. Also, if you think about even before Hawaii was colonized by Europeans and other folks, remember that ocean currents take plant material and those currents take plant seeds and so on, and they float basically until they land up on the shore of the island. Then birds come along and they'll eat some of them, and then they crack them everywhere all over the island. So that's one way new species can end up on an island. Okay. Adaptive radiation. So this is again about Hawaii. You see a lot of different varieties of plants that have formed on Hawaii. Now these two different species, like this one and maybe this one, they're so distinct they're probably not going to form hybrids. But there are examples of different species of plants that will produce hybrids. And so a geneticist, a very skilled geneticist, could probably make predictions as to which two species could produce offspring and which ones can't. You think about the plants that are here in the valley. They're very well adapted to dry environments. They may have descended from, when you think about cacti, the cacti that live here could have descended from cacti that were not as fit for surviving in such a dry environment. But as we became dry here over the centuries, the millennia, the plants that acquired those adaptations for surviving in very, very, very dry environments are the ones that were most successful. So we had bets in the past. Hybrid zone. So hybrid zone is when there's an incomplete reproductive barrier. So the outcome is that you have two different species that come together, they produce offspring. And then what do you call that offspring? Do you call them a distinct species? Scientists don't necessarily agree. They don't know for sure sometimes. Sometimes they do call them new species. So then when you produce a hybrid, that hybrid might start crossing with members of one variety as opposed to the other. So you could get stability or you could get fusion during speciation events. Okay. Oh, this is what I was talking about.
Isley.
Oh, it's the Isley. Yeah, Isley. Isn't that cool? Amazing. What is this showing us? I think it is showing us, different species of bears and how there's been a lot of events of species crossing together. Not all species can cross together, but a lot of them can. Gradualism. So gradualism is this idea that there's slow, constant change over time, But there was a guy named Stephen Jay Gould that came up with this idea that evolutionary change has not happened at a constant rate over time. He made the claim that there would be events that would cause rapid change, and then there would be periods of no change to little change. So punctuated means occurring here and there. So if there's an extinction event, he reasoned maybe it was because of some kind of catastrophic geological disturbance, which then changed how natural selection would work, or changed what the selective pressure would be in different environments. So this is probably the more accurate model. So you have change, stasis, rather than having constant change over time. This is about butterflies. So punctuated pattern versus gradual pattern. So this is showing us a very sudden change. If you look at this, slow change, sudden. The idea is maybe this variety moved into a completely different area very quickly, and that caused a very quick series of adaptations. All right. Oh, before you go anywhere, I'm going. You know what? Actually, I'm going to wait till Monday to give this to you. I will not be here Monday. I will see you guys later. These are just notes. That's all they are. I'm not going to be here on Monday. Thank you. Ready to Zoom. So I was wrapping up class period.